What happens when Hollywood royalty meets comedy royalty and the cameras are rolling? In just 15 seconds, one comment would shatter Meghan Markle's carefully crafted image and expose the entitled behavior that shocked an entire studio audience. Last night, something unprecedented happened on late-night television that nobody saw coming. Jon Stewart sat behind his familiar desk, that warm smile we all know lighting up his face, as he prepared for what should have been a routine celebrity interview. The Daily Show had welcomed countless A-listers over the years, and tonight was supposed to be no different. Meghan Markle, the former actress turned duchess turned media mogul, was scheduled to discuss her latest humanitarian project. The audience buzzed with anticipation, phones tucked away as requested, ready for what they assumed would be another polished promotional appearance. But from the moment Meghan walked onto that stage, something felt off. Her entrance, usually graceful and measured, seemed hurried. She waved to the crowd with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and as she settled into the guest chair, there was a tension in her shoulders that even the studio lights couldn't soften. Welcome back to The Daily Show. I'm Jon Stewart, and tonight we have Meghan Markle here with us, Jon began, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had made him America's most trusted fake news anchor. Thanks for being here, Meghan. Thank you for having me, Jon, Meghan replied, but her tone was clipped, professional, in a way that felt almost cold under the bright studio lights. Jon leaned forward slightly, his journalist instincts picking up on the unusual energy. So, you're here to talk about your new initiative, focusing on women's literacy programs globally. Tell us about that. Meghan's posture straightened, and for a moment, that familiar media training kicked in. Well, Jon, literacy is obviously something very close to my heart. Having traveled extensively and seen firsthand the challenges that women face in accessing basic education, I felt compelled to use my platform to make a real difference. The audience nodded approvingly. This was the Meghan they expected, poised and passionate about causes close to her heart. But Jon, veteran interviewer that he was, sensed there was more beneath the surface. That's wonderful, Jon said, genuine appreciation in his voice. And I understand this involves partnerships with several international organizations. Can you walk us through how someone watching at home might get involved? Here's where things began to shift. Meghan's smile faltered just slightly. Well, that's actually something my team is still finalizing. I mean, obviously, the most important thing is raising awareness, and having conversations like this one is really the first step. Jon's eyebrows raised almost imperceptibly. After decades of interviewing politicians and celebrities, he recognized the sound of someone who hadn't done their homework. Sure, awareness is important. But for viewers who want to take action tonight, is there a website they can visit? A way to donate or volunteer? The silence stretched just a beat too long. Meghan shifted in her chair, and when she spoke, there was a defensive edge creeping into her voice. Jon, I think you're missing the bigger picture here. This isn't just about websites or donations. This is about systemic change, about using influence responsibly. The studio audience, sensing tension, grew quieter. Jon, ever the professional, tried to steer back to safer ground. Absolutely, systemic change is crucial. And you've certainly had experience with that, having been part of the royal family. How did that experience shape your approach to this work? If Jon thought he was throwing Meghan a softball, he was wrong. Her jaw tightened visibly. I'd rather not discuss my time with the royal family if that's okay. I'm here to talk about literacy, not tabloid gossip. Jon blinked, surprised. The royal connection wasn't tabloid gossip. It was literally her most well-known public role, the thing that had made her a global figure in the first place. But he was nothing if not adaptable. Of course, I understand. Let's focus on the work itself then. You mentioned travel and seeing these challenges firsthand. Can you share a specific story that really drove this home for you? Another pause. Meghan's media training was clearly warring with something else, some internal frustration that was becoming harder to contain. Jon, I feel like you're trying to put me in a box here. You're asking for sound bites when what we're discussing is actually quite complex. The audience was now completely silent. This wasn't the friendly chat show banter they were used to. Jon's expression remained pleasant, but there was a sharpness in his eyes now. The look of a comedian who'd found an unexpected target. I'm not trying to put you in any box, Meghan. I'm just trying to understand the work you're passionate about so our audience can understand it too. That's kind of how interviews work. The comment landed with perfect comedic timing, and a few audience members couldn't help but chuckle. Meghan's face flushed slightly. I think maybe your audience is more sophisticated than you're giving them credit for, Jon. Now, it was Jon's turn to pause. In his decades of hosting, he dealt with difficult guests before. Celebrities who were promoting projects they clearly didn't care about. politicians who tried to dodge questions. But this felt different. This felt personal. "My audience is incredibly sophisticated," John said, his voice still calm but with an underlying firmness. "Which is why they deserve honest answers when someone comes on here to discuss their work. So let me ask you again, and maybe you can help me understand. You're launching a global literacy initiative. What does that actually look like in practice?" Meghan's composure was cracking now, and what emerged was not the polished duchess or the thoughtful humanitarian, but something else entirely. "What it looks like, John, is someone with a platform using it responsibly instead of making jokes about things that actually matter." The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze. Jon Stewart, the man who had built a career on finding humor in the most serious subjects, who had guided America through some of its darkest political moments with wit and wisdom, sat back in his chair. "I see," he said quietly. "So you think what we do here doesn't matter?" Meghan realized immediately that she'd made a mistake, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "I think there's a difference between entertainment and actually making a difference in the world." The audience was stunned. They were watching someone insult not just Jon Stewart, but the very show they'd come to see, the show that had meant so much to so many people over the years. John's face remained calm, but those who knew him well could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. Jon Stewart sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that anyone who had watched him navigate the aftermath of September 11th or challenge politicians on their hypocrisy would recognize. This was Jon Stewart, the journalist, not just the comedian. "You know what, Meghan? You're absolutely right. There is a difference between entertainment and making a difference." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "The difference is that entertainment admits what it island. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." Meghan's eyes widened. She clearly hadn't expected this response. "I don't know what you mean by that." "I mean," John continued, his voice growing stronger, "that when someone comes on this show to promote their work, we expect that work to actually exist. We expect there to be something concrete behind the press release." The audience was completely captivated now. This wasn't just television anymore. This was real conflict playing out in real time. Meghan shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "My work absolutely exists, John. Just because I don't have a website ready doesn't mean the work isn't real." John nodded slowly. "Okay, fair enough. So tell me about one woman whose life has been changed by this literacy program you're launching. Just one story." Another pause. Meghan's media training was screaming at her to deflect, to pivot, to find a way out of this corner she'd painted herself into. Instead, she chose attack. "I don't think it's appropriate to exploit individual stories for entertainment value, John. These are real people with real struggles." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was someone who had built her entire post-royal career on telling her own story, criticizing others for wanting to hear stories. John's eyebrows raised so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. "So let me get this straight. You can't tell us how people can help. You can't tell us what the program actually does, and you can't share any examples of its impact, because that would be exploitative. But you came on a talk show to promote it." Meghan's face was growing redder by the minute. "I came here to raise awareness about an important issue." "Which issue specifically?" John asked. "Because 15 minutes ago it was women's literacy. But now I'm honestly not sure what we're talking about." The audience was riveted. Some were starting to murmur among themselves. This was unlike anything they'd ever seen on The Daily Show. Meghan looked around the studio as if suddenly realizing where she was. What was happening? "I think maybe this interview has run its course," she said, starting to remove her microphone. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," John said, holding up a hand. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to come on my show, insult what we do here, dodge every single question, and then just walk away when it gets uncomfortable." Meghan froze, her hand still on her lapel microphone. "Excuse me? You heard me. Sit back down." John's voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority. "You want to talk about making a real difference? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about how you've used your platform since leaving the royal family. Let's talk about the specific, measurable impact you've had on the causes you claim to care about." Meghan slowly sat back down, but her posture was rigid, defensive. "I don't have to justify my work to you or to anyone else." "You do when you come on television asking for support?" John shot back. "You do when you're asking people to trust you with their time, their attention, and potentially their money. That's how this works." The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Even the production crew had stopped moving around. Everyone was watching this unprecedented moment unfold. "Fine," Meghan said, her voice sharp. You want specifics? I've spoken at dozens of events. I've met with world leaders. I've used my voice to highlight important issues. Speaking at events is an impact, Meghan. Meeting with world leaders is an impact. Using your voice is an impact unless that voice is saying something specific and actionable. John's frustration was showing now. The frustration of someone who had spent years actually making a difference, being lectured by someone who seemed to think good intentions were enough. Meghan stood up abruptly, yanking off her microphone with enough force that the sound technician winced. I don't have to sit here and be attacked. Attacked? John's voice rose for the first time. Attacked? I asked you to explain your work. I asked you to give our audience something concrete they could do to help. Those aren't attacks. Those are basic interview questions. But Meghan was already moving toward the exit, her heels clicking loudly on the studio floor in the otherwise silent space. John stood up behind his desk, something he rarely did during interviews. You know what the real tragedy is here, Meghan? There are people doing incredible work on literacy programs all over the world. Real programs with real impact. And they can't get 5 minutes of attention because the spotlight is always on people like you. People who talk a good game but have nothing behind it. Meghan stopped walking and turned around, her face flushed with anger. How dare you? How dare I what? How dare I ask you to be accountable for the platform you have? How dare I expect substance behind the sound bites? John stepped out from behind his desk now, addressing not just Meghan, but the entire audience. This is exactly what's wrong with celebrity activism. All talk, no action, and God forbid anyone asks questions. Meghan opened her mouth to respond, but John wasn't finished. You want to know what entertainment that makes a difference looks like? It looks like using your platform to elevate the work of people who are actually doing something. It looks like admitting when you don't know something instead of pretending you do. It looks like understanding that influence comes with responsibility, not entitlement. The final word hung in the air like a challenge. Meghan stared at him for a long moment, and for just a second, it seemed like she might sit back down, might try to salvage something from this disaster. Instead, she turned and walked straight off the stage, leaving John standing alone in front of a stunned audience. John watched her go, then slowly walked back to his desk. He sat down, straightened his tie, and looked directly into the camera. Well, he said, his voice returning to its familiar cadence, I guess we'll be right back after this commercial break. Assuming anyone's still watching. The audience erupted into applause, not the polite golf clap of a typical talk show, but genuine, thunderous applause. They had just witnessed something real, something unscripted, something that reminded them why they had always trusted Jon Stewart to tell them the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. As the camera stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, John remained at his desk for a moment, processing what had just happened. In all his years of broadcasting, he had never had a guest simply walk off the show. But as he looked out at his audience, still buzzing with energy and excitement, he realized something important had happened here tonight. Sometimes, the most important conversations are the ones that fall apart completely.